Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second day of our program, Developing CCUS Projects in Louisiana and the Gulf Coast. My name is Patricia Loria. I'm a Senior Client Engagement Lead with the Global CCS Institute. If you're joining us only for the second part of the day, welcome. For those of you who are back from yesterday, we certainly appreciate you coming back for our second half of the session. We're really excited about the panelists we have joining us today. We'll have people presenting on their projects that are going on in the Gulf Coast, as well as a great panel discussion on challenges to deployment and strategies to address them. That includes perspectives from governments, private sector, and environmental NGOs. As I stated yesterday, this event is jointly sponsored by the U.S. Energy Association and the U.S. Department of Energy, Fossil Energy. And we thank both of those organizations for their leadership and support of carbon capture. That leadership certainly is demonstrated in the United States, but also around the globe. After our kind of sessions in this main group, we will go to breakout sessions. I will give you more instructions on those, but you should have received an email on that as well. So without any further delay, let's get started. We're going to start with Hunter Johnson, who's a partner at Steptoe and Johnson. He's going to talk about the Lake Charles methanol project. I'm going to go from that to Jeff McDaniel, who is going to discuss the Velocys CCS project, and he is a VP of new projects at Velocys. And then we'll go to OGI's Kickstarter project. Lee Stockwell, the general manager of U.S. Carbon Capture and Storage from Shell, will be doing that presentation. So I will hand it over to Hunter.
Thank you, Patricia. And I'd like to thank DOE, USEA, the Global Carbon Capture Institute, Patricia and Jeff Erickson for the opportunity to speak about the Lake Charles methanol project. And I'd also like to thank some of the folks down in Louisiana, Secretary Tom Harris, Jason Lanclow, and Blake Canfield, who we've been working closely with in developing the Lake Charles methanol project. Just by way of background about my experience, I'm a Louisiana native. I've had a 35-year career in Washington, D.C., working in the energy industry and politics, and in Louisiana politics as well. I've been involved in carbon capture development for over 10 years, and I've worked with the Lake Charles development team since the project began over 10 years ago. I was a founding participant in the Carbon Capture Coalition, previously the Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative, and helped pass the 2018 amendments to 45Q that has incentivized a lot of new activity. And I presently represent multiple clients interested in carbon capture and tax credits across the CCUS value chain. If you turn to the first slide, about the Lake Charles methanol project, as I mentioned, it's been in development for some time. It's a very large project. It represents approximately a $4 billion US dollar investment. But it's developing a world scale. Lake Charles methanol is a world scale, low cost, blue methanol plant with carbon capture and sequestration near Lake Charles, Louisiana. And as you can see from the map graphic there, from the aerial photos, it's a site that's under lease from the Port of Lake Charles. Is ready for development, and the project is in a very late stage of development. The project will use commercially proven technologies to convert approximately 2.5 million metric tons annually of petroleum coke into methanol. Somehow I got muted there. I didn't touch anything, I promise. But as I was saying, hopefully you can hear me now. Again, as I said, it would convert approximately 2.5 million tons of petroleum coke into methanol and other valuable chemicals with minimal air emissions and close to zero solid emissions. It will produce approximately 4 million tons a year of methanol, and 85% of all the CO2 emissions will be captured and sequestered, which is equivalent to the annual emissions of approximately 850,000 cars. The Department of Energy has provided to the project, going back to 2016, a $2 billion conditional commitment for a loan guarantee because the project qualifies under the Fossil Energy Loan Guarantee Program. Fluor has executed a fully wrapped date certain lump sum turnkey EPC contract with liquidated damages and uncapped must fixed minimum performance standards for the project. The project is fully permitted, and a notice to proceed will be issued upon closing of equity and debt. And as I go through the introduction of the project, the timeline is that financial close is expected in second quarter next year. Could you go to the next slide, please? So what I wanted to introduce by this slide is the notion of blue methanol. I did mention it just a moment ago. But what this slide depicts is that there are really three pathways for the production of energy intensive products. There's a gray pathway, which would be normal production of chemicals and products that use fossil fuel as a feedstock without any kind of CO2 intensity control. There's a green pathway, which is receiving a lot of attention, which utilizes renewable feedstocks, whether it be by biomass or excuse me, renewable electricity involving electrolysis to produce chemicals like hydrogen or ammonia that would lead to a green pathway. In Lake Charles, because we're going to utilize carbon capture and sequestration, Lake Charles methanol will produce its methanol via a blue pathway, which will be lower carbon intensity methanol, which we believe will be a privileged product in the marketplace. Just a few comments about methanol. As you can see from the picture, methanol is used for a variety of different products. Basically, most of everything that we utilize in the chemical industry or in manufacturing, it's used to produce acetic acid, furniture, solvents, paints, insulation, and increasingly, it's becoming an important product for shipping. Because methanol can be stored at room temperature, because it can be reduced to a liquid, it is a very good pathway as a fuel. And in the shipping industry in particular in Europe is under new constraints and new objectives with respect to lowering carbon intensity. We believe that methanol, along with ammonia, blue ammonia, and of course a lot has been talked about blue hydrogen as a interim pathway to green hydrogen. But we think that blue methanol is going to be a very valuable product that can be produced, lowering carbon intensity and helping companies and governments reaching net zero 50, net zero 60 commitments. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to depict from this slide is the vast opportunity that there is at Lake Charles Methanol to reduce CO2 emissions. We're going to have a lot of CO2 emissions that can be captured and used for sequestration. And because we're using petroleum coke as a feedstock, it really, what this project, the value proposition, aside from the blue methanol that we're producing, this is a pathway to decarbonize oil slates. So petcoke is generally a waste product from the refining of heavy crudes in the United States and other places in the world. Predominantly today, petcoke is exported to other countries where it is used in cement kilns and other heat-related processes to produce other chemicals or other other manufacturing. And by preventing that petcoke from being exported and used, I think, in an environmentally irresponsible way, we can use that petcoke to produce higher value chemicals. And I would mention that petcoke is the lowest value, highest BTU source available. So it trades at a discount to natural gas or to coal, which results in Lake Charles methanol as having the lowest cash cost of any methanol project available in the world, actually, at least in the lowest octile of projects worldwide. So we believe that this is a one-of-a-kind opportunity for oil industry decarbonization, because that petcoke, which is ultimately burned in other places, is a tier 3 emission that oil companies have a lot of trouble addressing. Could I go to the next slide, please? So what this slide puts into perspective is, again, this environmental opportunity that exists at Lake Charles Methanol. What this does is it shows the CO2 in metric ton basis comparison between the petcoke that's been exported versus the investment in renewable, non-hydro renewable energy generation on a CO2 avoided basis. And what you see here is that, which is really startling, is that the export of petcoke from the United States really has on a carbon leakage basis, has diminished a lot of the progress that the United States has made by its billions of dollars of investment in renewable generation. So this concept of petcoke leakage and being able to use petcoke in a way to produce, as we say, blue methanol, we think is just an outstanding benefit to the United States, and something that is into the world, of course, because of climate change. And it's really something that can be addressed through carbon capture and sequestration. Next slide, please. So just turning to Lake Charles Methanol's advantages with respect to carbon capture. We have a very low carbon capture cost. You can find this type of cost analysis in a variety of different places. This chart is really from the reference of the NETL in 2013, their report. But this is a really important graph for Louisiana, because of course the opportunity with the 45Q tax credit is that the tax credit can enable projects, because projects that are below, low on the capture cost standpoint can be complemented by the wide availability of sequestration capacity in Louisiana. And so being lower on that cost curve for capture provides that much more of an advantage for being able to create a sequestration site in Louisiana. So the reason for our low capture cost is the fact that we're using gasification technology, and the cost of the carbon capture essentially baked into the process by which methanol is created from syngas from the gasifiers and going through an acid gas removal system. And that's part of the incremental cost of producing methanol. So, we believe we're probably the lowest cost capture source in the state and probably in the United States, even though, as you can see, the opportunities for ammonia in Louisiana are also low on the cost curve. Next slide, please. So what this picture is a picture from a study that was done by the University of Texas at Austin. I think a lot of people here probably know a lot about their expertise, and fortunately, Southwest Louisiana, South Louisiana in general is very well studied in terms of its geophysical characteristics. And one of the great things about the state of Louisiana with respect to carbon capture is that there's wide availability of pore space that is generally geophysically suitable for carbon capture and sequestration. And when I say carbon capture and sequestration, at this point, I'm talking about non-EOR sequestration. I know we had a presentation from Denbury yesterday, and Lake Charles Methanol, from a legacy standpoint, has had an enhanced oil recovery pathway for disposition of the CO2 from the project. But the project is simultaneously evaluating non-EOR sequestration, and we are advantageously located in close proximity to the Green Line. We expect to be connected to the Green Line, but as you can see from this map, there's just a wide variety of locations. This particular study identified 38 well locations within the study range that could take all of our CO2. And we believe that there's just a wide variety of different places where we could access pore space and sequester the CO2 from the Lake Charles project in close proximity to the location of the project. I will just note for your eye that the red zones that you can see on this map are generally speaking, they're legacy oil and gas development areas. And of course, if you're looking from a risk perspective, it's really going to be in the interest of a project looking for a suitable candidate site to be divorced from those types of legacy operations because of just the uncertainty related to all the activity that's occurred in those oil fields and those oil fields. I will say another advantage being in South.
Hunter, I'm going to throw, you have about 1 more minute. Okay, you're running a little bit over time.
Okay, I didn't find this out beforehand. So next slide, please. So just to speak briefly, I know Jason's going to talk about it, but Louisiana is also very advantageous because of the Louisiana Geologic Sequestration Act that's been passed. It really is going to create a one-stop shop for permitting a facility once Louisiana does get primacy for Class 6 wells. And I mentioned the loan guarantee before. And with respect to 45Q, the Lake Charles project has a term sheet in place with a tax equity provider that is going to buy all of the tax credits for the project. So we've already concluded that negotiation. Next slide, please. And just a quick comment about this is because we're 4 million tons of CO2 a year, we can really become a sequestration site for other projects as well, because the incremental costs are going to be advantageous to other projects. Next slide, please. And this is our timeline. So we expect financial close sometime second quarter next year. A lot of the timeline is just the amount of time it takes to close a deal with the Department of Energy. And there's a lot more that I can say about it. I'm happy to entertain any questions, but that's my presentation. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Hunter. And we'll have Jeff from Velocis, Jeff McDaniel, come on. If you do have questions for any of the panelists, please add them to the chat box. And we do have some time at the end of all three presentations for questions. Thanks.
Great. Thanks all. Appreciate the chance to give an overview of the work that we're doing. And I'll try to build upon the comments that Hunter and the speakers yesterday made. So I'm a Vice President of New Projects with Velocis. Next slide. Just a little bit in terms of who we are. We see ourselves as a sustainable fuels technology company. And specifically, we're focused on the aviation fuel space. And as I'll talk about that, a reason for that focus is because it is one of those hard to decarbonize industries, whereas we've made a lot of headway in some industries, not so much on the aviation front. We're a smaller company, but we're working with some really talented partners, which include British Airways and Shell, in particular for our project in the UK. And part of what we bring to the table is a proprietary technology that enables us to meet fuels that meet all of the regulatory standards, performance requirements, etc. And in particular, be able to convert a difficult to process biogenic waste food feedstocks. That is really kind of our forte and focus. And the reason why I'm here today is, as with the gasification projects you just heard about, ours is also a gasification-based project. And so, as I like to say, it's carbon capture ready. We separate the CO2 as an inherent part of our process. We can then purify that CO2 to the pipeline specifications, and that additional capture of CO2 enables us to actually get to a net negative emissions transportation fuel, which is unique in the marketplace. So next slide. Yeah, here's what I was talking about. Just one slide on the aviation industry and why we're focused on it. What you see on that top line is kind of the trend in CO2 emissions. I mean, the aviation industry overall is not a huge player in terms of CO2 footprint. It's around 3% of global emissions. But what is unique about it is the trajectory upwards. You know, there's a significant amount of growth, and you guys have all noticed like winglets on the planes and more gentle landing patterns, etc. But there's only so much efficiency you're going to be able to squeeze out. In order for them to meet the objectives that they are under, there's going to need to be a kind of a step change, and the step change, as identified by McKinsey on behalf of the World Economic Forum, really is sustainable aviation fuel. It's fuels that are fully qualified in today's engines, but have a much lower carbon footprint than today's fuels. So next slide. So Sonia, next slide. So back to the earlier point. So how do we get there? How do we provide a fuel that fully meets the requirement but has a lower carbon footprint? Well, our starting point is to use feedstocks that are basically waste feedstocks, or feedstocks that are available at sufficient scale today. They're being collected today. They're essentially waste or low value products, materials. And we for our process, we could actually utilize a range of different feedstocks. We're focused on two, and we focus on the ones that make sense in the region. So while I won't highlight it today, we are developing a municipal solid waste to jet fuel project. There we're partnered with British Airways and Shell. And in the UK, we're doing that because of the very high tipping fees and the established infrastructure for moving MSW around the country. It's not well known, but a very substantial portion of the MSW generated in the UK is actually shipped out for power to burn facilities. Here in the US, we're focused on wood chips, and specifically in the Southeast. And we're using wood chips, the low value sort of wood chips, those from the limbs, the tops, the thinnings, the portions of the plantation forest, which really have little or no value, and in some cases are just left in the field to rot. So we start with those, and then in the next slide, I'll show you how we convert them. So we go through a series of different steps. So the first step, as I mentioned, is this gasification step. There we've been working with a firm known as TRI. They're regarded as, definitely one of the leaders in the biomass gasification field. We're able to break down that solid feedstock into a gaseous stream, the syngas. And then the next step, we are specifically working with Air Liquide and their Rectisol process to remove impurities such as sulfur, ammonia, and as a byproduct, CO2. So you see the high purity CO2 is circled, and this is really what enables to be a really good fit for carbon capture and sequestration, is that, again, it's an inherent part of our process is that we essentially co-produce a byproduct CO2. Once we've removed those impurities, this is where our technology fits in. We're able to now couple or link those small molecules into larger molecules. And then the final step with that FT product will go through a hydrocracker upgrading step to meet the on-specification jet fuel or renewable diesel. So we can produce either of those distillate fuels. And throughout this process, we've been working with Worley as our engineering partner to lead us through the pre-feed studies that we were currently in at this point in time. So next slide. Just a quick snapshot on our technology, what's unique about it. I mean, these facilities, these biorefineries will be a smaller scale than the typical refineries. That is driven by the ability to aggregate the feedstock. So we want to be able to pull our feedstock within a 50 to 75 mile radius of the site. That leads to a still sizable plant, but much smaller than a world scale refinery. And what we've been able to do is develop a synthesis reactor, which operates at productivity levels 10 to 15-fold higher than any commercial Fischer Tropsch reactor today. And that's why it's well suited to these scale facilities. And we've gotten it to the point of having operated commercial scale units, which would be deployed in this facility and other commercial facilities. So next slide. So here's the site. So we're pleased to be invited to participate in this Louisiana focused webinar. However, we're not quite in Louisiana. We're just across the Mississippi River from Vidalia, Louisiana. We're in Natchez, Mississippi is where we're located. We have secured a site adjacent to an existing industrial park on the river. You can see it has a lot of great infrastructure for supporting a biorefinery. And next slide, and one of the pieces of that great infrastructure is that it is nearby an established CO2 pipeline, as was highlighted by Denbury yesterday. So really about 15 miles from the Denbury pipeline. And what we have chosen to do is we think through how we want to incorporate the CCS is we have teamed with Oxy Low Carbon Ventures. Tony and his team, with their work of developing their CO2 sequestration hub. Whereas, the geological formations nearby could, possibly enable us to try to do this on our own. We haven't for the reasons several of the other speakers have talked about. One is scale. We'll be more in the 500,000 tons per year. So at that scale, kind of fighting economy of scale cost penalties. And two, candidly, is expertise. Honestly, we've got our hands full with just trying to pull off all of the biorefinery elements. Being able to team with an established partner who has the core capabilities to handle the CCS point really makes a sense for us. And it enables us, to kind of split some of the value that's generated. And what's unique about the biorefinery opportunity is, yes, we get to participate in the 45Q, but we're not limited to the 45Q. Utilizing carbon capture and sequestration, we lower the carbon intensity of our footprint. As we lower the carbon intensity of our product, we're able to secure greater revenues under the low carbon fuel standard in California. And that additional revenue helps provide some assurance of long-term value being delivered from the CCUS efforts. And to give you a sense for the magnitude, the next slide there, yep, go back one on the bar chart. There we go. I'm on slide 102. Wow, been talking for a while. So here's where you see the carbon intensity score. So these are the scores as per the California GREET model. Because we're taking renewable feedstocks and using renewable power. And then we're sequestering the byproduct CO2 that's produced. We're actually able to achieve a deeply negative carbon intensity score, which will be unique in the aviation space. And I think is part of the real enabler for the project. That's part of what distinguishes the project and also, underpins some of the key revenue streams. So just to wrap up with the last slide, so kind of where we are is we think what we're being able to do is to deliver a commercially demonstrated solution for decarbonizing air travel and heavy transport. We do see a significant opportunity for carbon capture, use, and storage at our facilities, and not just at the first facility in Natchez, Mississippi, but we've already identified other sites in Louisiana and throughout the Southeast U.S. where we think this model can be replicated and really enable to advance both the CCS and the aviation industry goals. With that, we'll call it a wrap. I look forward to answering any questions you might have in the following session. Thank you.
Great, and we'll move on to Lee Stockwell from Shell.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to speak today. There's a good and a bad thing about coming last in the panel and on the second day. The good thing is that I'll be able to catch up some time because many of the folks have already commented on some of the things that we intended to discuss. And so I think the discussion will go quickly. The bad thing is that you may hear some things you've already heard before, so bear with me in that regard. I wanted to present today not necessarily in my role as GM of carbon capture, utilization, and storage for Shell, but rather as a member of the OGCI, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, and kind of the hub and cluster model that we are working with. And you'll see the 13 members of OGCI are shown at the bottom there, traditional oil and gas companies all working to progress towards greener futures. And what the OGCI does in this space is create a collaborative environment for all of us to leverage our strengths. And those strengths can be technical, they can be commercial, they can be in the government relations spaces, and they can also be helping folks pull together the specific value chains that can leverage CCUS and the pathways that that my colleagues on the panel have discussed over the last two presentations in the idea of low cost or low carbon fuels, as well as general 45Q initiatives. If you go to the next slide for me, please. What you'll see is that OGCI has invested in 5 Kickstarter hubs, one of those being in the Gulf of Mexico, where we would look at the broader source of emitters kind of across the different industries and pull together things like what was described for Velocys, where you're in a position where you may not have an expertise to work the carbon capture and sequestration, but our expertise as a broader group of folks who are savvy in the subsurface provide that realm, the step into the sequestration portion of the discussion. My topic today is more around the challenges associated with the sequestration component, as the capture pieces I think have been pretty well discussed over the last few days. If you go to the next slide for me. I think it's pretty well known around the opportunity space within Louisiana. You'll see this chart on the upper right-hand side, which is incorrectly sourced. That should be the Southern States Energy Board, but it shows the emitters within Louisiana. There's approximately 170 major emitters of over 100,000 tons per year. And if you look at the corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, there's a clustering of emitters. There are many of those that are above 250,000 per year and several that are above millions per year, kind of the scales that were discussed in the Lake Charles methanol project. So there's a huge opportunity for CO2 volumes. Excuse me, you're getting my dog. Sorry about that. The implications of being at home. I hope you feel as protected as I do. Excuse me. No. Stay. Good boy. All right. Sorry about that. Going to put him in his crate. The emitters that are on the right-hand side there, on the upper right-hand side, give us an opportunity to bring together several different types of industries that we have in front of us. The opportunity, I think affords us a chance to work through many different industries and enable value chains. And a couple of those are shown at the bottom. One around renewable fuels, and that was discussed. You can see the pathway to California for the low carbon fuels standard and the credits associated with it become a primary vantage point for us to look for how to gather more value above 45Q, which is Hunter mentioned before, for a lot of our traditional capture cost won't enable us to move forward. And the other side of this is really looking at kind of the hydrogen space, the blue hydrogen space, and even blue ammonia and blue methanol, as Hunter mentioned as well, provide other opportunities for us to collect sources and put them into the ground together. And working together as a group, a collective group, we can create more opportunities to do that. I think I want to spend some time on the challenges here, on the policy and incentivization, the liability and post-combustion capture side of this. On the incentivization, obviously 45Q doesn't quite make it all the way there. And I think as we see LCFS begin to entrench itself in California and further broaden to places like Canada or other states, the Pacific Northwest and the Northeast are also looking at it, you will see more and more opportunity for growth within that market, but it's still a bit immature in that. So within the areas, getting things like tax package incentivizations are things you start to see, and you see those associated with places that have done recent announcements like Grawn Industries, the renewable fuels in the Port of Baton Rouge, or CF, which is talking about further greenhouse gas reductions in their Ascension Parish facility and expansion. But the policy around liability is one that still needs further addressing, and we see that in the conversation of limiting to only aquifers, saline aquifers, as opposed to looking at depleted gas fields, which we studied kind of in depth. And as was mentioned before, the necessity to deal with some of the legacy wells and the prolific nature of the oil and gas industry within southern Louisiana is one we've struggled with. And that's one I think you're going to see more and more folks look to the roots of least resistance, so to speak, in the saline aquifer. From an infrastructure perspective, as shown as the green line from Denbury is the primary CO2, that still means you have to build trunk lines to reach it if you want to move from east to west. It's limited if you want to move from west to east. And so there's still infrastructure there that is required. And we see that from the perspective of the states that are coming together for the CO2 infrastructure memorandum of understanding. Louisiana is one of those states to build out a broader CO2 network. Because the requirement to transport CO2 in a dense phase for us is one that it's not as easy to flip prior infrastructure. So you have to spend your time understanding what the impact on your project is of that pipeline, the additional costs. The other part is making sure you understand the hurdles associated with 45Q, with LCFS, and even with the Class 6. I think LDNR and EPA are working well together so far, but it's early days in the sense of what it will take to move those things through. And you're seeing timelines estimating anywhere from 2 years to 4 or more to get through a Class 6 permitting. And how you build your ability to start CO2 sequestration with partners associated with that variability and timeline is one that requires thought. The commercial structures for emitters, obviously not all emitters are created equal. Some would only be qualifying on a 45Q, others would have pathways to the LCFS. Those are things you also have to think through, as well as the landowner mentality. What does it take from a landowner point of view to make certain that we don't set the market in a way that exacerbates some of the existing oil and gas leases? And I think getting some folks who are fairly savvy in the oil and gas way around to this is really a pore space conversation is one that we need to make certain that the market's established so it continues to incentivize work on these sorts of projects. So at a high level, those are some of the challenges associated with the project. I'll skip the last slide, which is just a value chain perspective. I think it's more cartoonish than others, but at a summary level, it just shows how that model works. And you're seeing it from ourselves, you're seeing it from Oxy and several other folks right now, kind of working with a lot of different players to bring together this hub and cluster model. And it's one that I do think will work for us. The time frame for the ability to move forward, I think, is a bit still uncertain, depending on where you sit with your Class 6 permitting and where you sit with some of these commercial models. But I do think you'll see over the next 3 or 4 years really double down in this space of hub and cluster. And I'll leave it there. Thank you for bearing with me and my dog. Apologies for the interruption.
No problem, Lee. Thank you for that presentation. So I'll invite Jeff and Hunter to come back online, turn on your video and turn off your mute, and ask some of the questions that we've kind of gathered here in the question box. Please feel free to continue to add questions to that as well. So starting off, and this is for Hunter, can you talk about what carbon capture technology is the project using?
Sure, I'll refer to the acid gas removal system and its Lurgi-Rectisol technology, which I think everybody, most people in the industry will recognize.
Great. For Jeff, can you repeat the anticipated annual output of your plant in Natchez, and would you consider this your typical plant size moving forward?
Yes, for the we're currently evaluating 2 configurations, which are 50 and 70 million gallons per year of final product. And we do view that as kind of the optimal, again, driven by the feedstock availability. Per normal forestry operations, you typically want to be able to gather all your feedstock within 50, at most 75 miles. And in order to meet all of the RFS, the renewable fuel standard requirements, you know, you're only taking, shall we say, those low bits of wood. So we would be bringing in, you know, 1 million green tons per day of I mean, a million pounds per day of green wood into the facility.
Thanks, Jeff. Lee, we got a question on pore space. We had some questions yesterday that couldn't get answered. So I'll kind of put a couple of these together. The question here was, can you elaborate more on the challenges around conversations with the landowners about pore space discussions? And then we had questions yesterday that potentially you can answer. One was, you know, any idea what a pore space lease could look like in Louisiana? What would pore space ownership subordinate or be subordinated by?
Yeah, I'll say that there's a couple of things that we are, as I think as an industry, facing how we set this up. And of course, once you begin to proliferate the number of leases, they tend to all get to the same space from a legal point of view. You create a market, and we want to be careful about how we create that market. I think one of the big conversations that historically has played a role in the oil and gas leases is around royalties. And so what is the expectation with regards to setting royalty rates associated with what comes out or from what goes in from an injection point of view? So how do you set yourself up to make certain that you are not handing over a significant portion of the credits or potential value pathways, and that you're doing something that works in for everyone's favor? And I think that's the space we want to make certain we don't want to lose the ability to create the projects that we see add value to society. At the same time, you want to make certain that the landowners are appropriately compensated and incentivized. And I think that's the primary discussion there. I think that in terms of the subordinate piece of this, I'm not certain I'm the right person to answer that question. But I do think there is a lease structure that we will find as we work with kind of our major counterparts there of how we approach this. And of course, I do think that over the course of probably the next 2 years, as a lot of folks look at land acquisition in these spaces, you'll see them begin to converge. And I won't tell you that I know what that model will look like, but it's one that I think is extremely important that we start working together on now, so that we don't end up in a position where we are creating kind of massive discrepancies within the market. Now, obviously, there's an antitrust piece there, so we won't get down to absolute details. But I think from the perspective of how we move this forward, what we do in these early days will kind of set the standard.
Patricia, I can address that issue. In Louisiana, of course, the surface owner owns the pore space, and I think that if, by and large, if someone was left to their full control, they would buy the pore space. So you wouldn't lease the pore space. I mean, there's no reason to lease the pore space if you could acquire it. And under Louisiana law, the pore space is owned by the surface owner could certainly sell you the pore space. And I think that's the model that FutureGen used in Illinois. And there's that would be pretty straightforward. There may be some cases where an entity cannot sell you the pore space, and so you might lease it instead. And then what you will find that there's an intersection between the Louisiana sequestration law and the lease, because the sequestration law does give certain rights to the developer of a sequestration site in Louisiana that ultimately ends with the state taking ownership of the pore space. So it really depends on what your situation and who owns the place where you're actually targeting for sequestration. But we believe that there's different ways that you can acquire the pore space, and of course, to Lee's point, the value of the pore space, there's no real predicates out there. It's not the same as mineral rights, because you're not actually acquiring something that's of value. So it's really sort of in the mind of the beholder. So it's a negotiation, but pore space really ought to be something that does not look like, from a value standpoint, a royalty from a mineral lease. It's going to be something that's because it's pore space that's otherwise doesn't have a value, because by definition, in order to get your certificate in Louisiana, you're going to have to show that there's no minerals left to develop at the site.
That's a great point. Thank you, Hunter. I appreciate the step in and clarification. I think the other thing that just from human nature point of view, because this hasn't happened very often, people are worried that they're not getting a good deal. And so you see some hesitancy there as well.
Absolutely, 100%.
So we have a couple more kind of questions on storage, and I'll throw these out to the group. And Lee, certainly feel free to answer, but Hunter, if you have thoughts. So there's one question on offshore and how people are considering offshore storage for Louisiana. And then another question so it reads, regarding depleted oil and gas fields, but not EOR or GOR, do you still see any opportunity for pure sequestration, or have you given up on that idea?
Maybe to answer the second one first, I don't think we've given up on the idea. I think we're still working to understand and study it, but you have to recognize that where EPA and LDNR sit right now, essentially you'd have to go back and re-abandon to a certain quality each one of the legacy wells that would be in that. They would require things such as cement bond logs to prove what the quality there is. And there's a lot of those that predate kind of our current standards. And trying to remediate a lot of those would be very expensive to do. So just from a financial point of view, it adds burden to your project. And in that regard, as Hunter said, you look to stay away from things that would increase the liability long term. And I think that's what you're finding is you're going to move to the path of least resistance, even though we're going to continue to work to understand what the optionality is for depleted gas fields. Maybe shifting to the offshore space. I think more work has been done kind of in the offshore Texas realm than offshore Louisiana in terms of moving kind of what the potential opportunities there are. But you are seeing movement from a commercial point of view. I think there are several of the companies who are both looking at shallow offshore fields. I say shallow water offshore fields, probably a better way to put that, as well as some of the existing pipelines about whether they can be utilized. So I do think it's something that will move. I think in the longer term, you'll see a push for some of the platform owners to move away from abandonment and decommissioning charges within their books to create these injection sites. It makes sense from a financial point of view that there's an opportunity set there. And I think you'll see some of that pipeline flipped to go out in that direction. I think the other thing that'll be interesting to see is really what export looks like for some of the products moving into other markets. So I think you're going to see an export of certain carbon-enabled blue products to move out of the Gulf Coast, and that may enable higher pricing models for things that have lower abandonment issues or legacy issues. So if you were to inject CO2 in one of the deeper reservoirs offshore, you wouldn't be worried about what happens from an onshore drinking water point of view. So there's an opportunity there, but you're going to need kind of higher dollar value chains to enable that thinking. At least that's my opinion.
I'm sorry about that, the background, but I'll just add the point that, as far as offshore is concerned, that the big issue is, of course, is its proximity to projects. It's just farther away. So you have to build pipelines in order to get offshore. And if you have an alternative that's closer to your project, that's from a cost perspective, you're going to be driven that direction every time. And at least in Louisiana, there is, as I said before, a large amount of pore space that's theoretically available if you can negotiate the rights to it. But an advantage of offshore, of course, is that either the state or the federal government owns the pore space in those circumstances. So, but there's availability of water bottoms in the state as well. So, it's all about location and proximity to your project. That's a major cost driver.
Great. And we are a bit over time, but I just wanted to throw out one more question for the group. And that was, how has the local community responded to these proposed carbon capture projects from an environmental justice perspective? Do they view CCS any differently than more conventional projects? So I'll kind of ask that of Hunter and Jeff.
Well, I mean, that's a complicated question because CCS includes both enhanced oil recovery and non-EOR sequestration. Most of the latter hasn't been done yet. But, in the case of Lake Charles, we did an environmental impact statement. We had 2 public hearings, one in Lake Charles, one in Houston. The one in Houston was in close proximity to Denbury's oil operations. A lot of people don't know it, but those operations occur underneath where neighborhoods where people live because the mineral estate is severed from the service estate. So, the truth is that this kind of operations can take place in close proximity to populated areas. And we had almost no, at least in Southwest Louisiana and Southeast Texas, there's really almost no one showed up to oppose what we're doing in any way. So I think that if, public engagement is super important and necessary in education, but I think that and also in the Future Gen also did a big EIS in Illinois with respect to their project. So I think that the record so far is great acceptance of carbon capture and sequestration with respect to these types of projects.
Yeah, I think I will add that when there is an overall positive environmental impact of the project, that certainly helps. I mean, you need to take care of all of the other elements as you go through the approval process for our project. We did complete the federal level environmental assessment and passed with flying colors. And so, it's been well received by the local community. And we're very thankful for that support.
All right, well, thank you to these panelists. This has been a great conversation. Certainly apologize to some of the folks that we may not have gotten to your questions, but please feel free to kind of connect with some of our panelists via LinkedIn, or they have their emails there, and I'm sure they would kind of be happy to take your questions. But thank you again for this kind of great discussion.
Thanks.
Take care, all.
All right. So I will invite Adam Peltz from EDF, Jason Lanclose from the State Energy Office of Louisiana. And then it looks like we might be having some technical difficulties with Benjamin Hurd, who is the project lead and principal for Gulf Coast Sequestration. But we will kind of get started with the conversation and hopefully he will join us shortly. Adam, Jason, thanks for joining us today. Thankfully, my first question was to Adam. And, again, I will be asking some moderated questions, but certainly feel free to put questions in the chat box and we will answer them a little bit later in the conversation. So Adam, starting with you, you're from an environmental NGO. So we'd like to kind of get your perspective first regarding your work supporting CCS deployment while ensuring that these projects meet CO2 mitigation objectives without any other environmental hazards. And, we just kind of had that question about whether or not we're seeing environmental NGO kind of in community support for these projects. So it's a nice segue.
Great. Well, thank you, Patricia, and thanks to GCCSI for having me on today's great webinar. So I am a senior attorney at Environmental Defense Fund, which is a national environmental nonprofit. We've been involved on and off in CCS for the past 10 or 12 years. And for us, our engagement is predicated on the notion that CCS clearly has a role to play in upcoming, what is now sort of short-term goals of carbon neutral electric generation in the next 10 or 15 years, and a carbon neutral economy in the next 20 to 30 years. It's hard to imagine getting there without carbon capture and sequestration. It's kind of fundamental to the concept of carbon neutral as opposed to zero carbon. And so we see this as important, as an important component in many sectors of the economy, but we also want to make sure that CCS rules and projects have environmental integrity, which we define as no CO2 leaks to the atmosphere, no contamination of groundwater, and no earthquakes. And we think that the way to get there is a robust implementation of Class 6, possibly with some tweaks along the way, with well-funded, trained, and staffed overseeing agencies, whether that's EPA or delegated state agencies, and then certain supplementary state rules that go beyond Class 6 and touch on issues that are beyond the scope of Class 6. And so we think that environmental integrity can certainly be achieved, but it's something that has to be worked towards, monitored, and reported out transparently. So I just want to talk for a second about some public perception issues that are worth considering as we go along on this path. One set of issues comes from the climate activist universe, who are concerned that CCS represents a perpetuation of fossil fuel use, with the paradigmatic case being coal power plants to CO2 EOR. Now, everyone on this webinar knows that that is only one pathway of CCS, and probably not the dominant pathway, and seemingly certainly not the pathway that was being discussed this morning in the last panel. But from a national basis, that is sort of the perception of CCS. And so that needs to be dealt with, and a fuller discussion of all the different pathways and ways in which CCS can be utilized to reduce CO2 emissions across the economy is essential. So those are going to be some needed conversations. And then just at the very end of the last panel, there was some talk about environmental justice and environmental justice communities and their perception of this. Obviously, it varies from community to community. I do a lot of work in California, which is where these LCFS, these big dollar LCFS credits come from. And there, EJ communities have stopped or slowed down CCS work and have been limiting the inclusion of CCS into climate policies there on grounds that, the facilities that these communities have been trying to, either get out of their communities or get to reduce impacts, they feel like they'll get a free pass if CO2 is reduced, but criterion pollution remains. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that we're talking to these communities, and having an open meeting is good, but just because people don't show up doesn't mean people aren't angry. And the other thing that needs to be done, I think, is more thought about whether there are synergies to simultaneously reduce criterion pollution, air quality problems, along with CO2, to make facilities impact neutral and not just CO2 neutral. And then the other public trust issue I want to talk about briefly is liability and state liability relief, which is certainly a touchy subject, but it's really important. And we completely understand that capital like certainty, and there are very long-term, these are long-term projects with long-term risks. And so there's been a push for states to adopt liability relief provisions, transferring liability to the state, indemnifying operators along those lines. But I want to sound a note of caution on that because there are drawbacks to that approach. For one thing, it signals that, contrary to industry rhetoric, operators are sufficiently uncertain that they will be able to get this right, that they need to be relieved to the public, by the public. And so it's difficult to say, we know what we're doing, we've been doing this for a long time, it's going to be fine, but please state, take all of our liability. So that's, that's something that needs to be managed. And there's also the issue of, the creation of a moral hazard when you relieve someone's liability in advance. You want incentives for operators to do these projects right, and we know they can be done right. But if you relieve liability in a broad way, including regular common law liability, then suddenly you create a situation where there's less incentive for operators to do a workmanlike job. And all of this makes it more difficult to sell CCS to a skeptical public. And even even if the Louisiana public has one opinion, national public having another opinion is not good for things like continuation of 45Q and expansion of 45Q. And operators and policymakers in Louisiana need to think bizarrely about what Californians think about this if they want those $180 a ton credits. And so what we think on liability is that, ideally there would be no state role in liability, and it would be dealt with by private insurance markets. We realize that those markets aren't there yet. So, thinking about a phased approach, how to jumpstart capital, without creating these long-term trust issues. And Louisiana's existing liability program is not bad on that front. There were some efforts, I think, last session to weaken the program, which I don't believe succeeded. But it's something that we and others are watching closely. And I think I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much, Adam, for all of those kind of really interesting thoughts and, bringing the environmental NGO kind of perspective to the conversation. And I'm going to kind of go now to the state's perspective. So we have Jason here with the state of Louisiana, Office of Natural Resources. And just to kind of highlight, this is a great panel because we have environmental NGOs, the state, and then someone who's actually kind of doing a project here. So hopefully we'll get some of this kind of great conversation amongst kind of public-private that we know is really important to advance CCS. So Jason, I will ask you, and Tom certainly touched on this, Secretary Harris as well yesterday. Louisiana has been one of the most active states on CCS legislation and legal and regulatory report. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the governor's commitment to net zero emissions, as well as what Louisiana has been doing, both around kind of storage risk, but other incentives around CCS? So just kind of your view on what's the most important ways that Louisiana is making itself attractive to CCS.
Absolutely. And Patricia, I want to thank you and Jeff and all of Global CCS for having us on. I think that one of the things that's taught me in the last several months is that I miss those opportunities for collaboration. When we talk about NGOs and others being in the same space, those have led to so many positive things that have propelled CCUS to really be something that we're really proud of in terms of how it's advancing. And for the state, our opportunities for stakeholder engagement. Obviously, these types of sessions give us just a tremendous opportunity to get folks together. So I appreciate the time today, and this panel, I think, clearly illustrates that the parties that need to be at the table are here, and that we've got some things that we need to work on, but there is a spirit of collaboration, and I think that spirit here is very strong. And you mentioned, and Secretary Harris mentioned, the governor's climate initiative. And just a little background on that and why that particular situation and initiative is so important. One of the things that it's doing currently is bringing all the state agencies together. And I think that anyone who lives or who has visited Louisiana sees that Louisiana has a huge coastal footprint, and that's so important to the state from so many different perspectives, from a seafood, fishing, and recreational aspect. And climate has started to become, I think, a focus for the state and for companies who live and work and do business here, which is exciting for us because I think that it's bringing a lot of different entities to the table that normally haven't been to the table together. And I think that for us, we very clearly recognize that having everyone here and working through policies and programs like CCUS with everyone together makes it a stronger program. And I think that one of the things that we very clearly understood very early on in this process is that we needed to have a clear regulatory pathway, and that we understood that from an economic standpoint, even 2 years ago, without the detrimental effects that COVID's had on the economies of states and our federal government, that we needed to do something, even if it wasn't from an economic incentive, that we needed to create a regulatory pathway and really create certainty from an investment standpoint to make sure that companies had a very clear understanding of what it meant to do business in the state. We were extremely fortunate to have a bill that was passed in 2009, House Bill 661, which really set the stage. And I think that, you know, we will applaud those lawmakers for kind of looking at sequestration even back then as an opportunity, because the federal incentives at the time just weren't significant enough to really bring folks to the table as they are now. Obviously with 45Q, I think that Keith Tracy did a tremendous job of really boiling down a very complex set of legislation in 45Q and how to practically implement it. And for us, we're trying to do the same thing with regulatory pathways, with people who want to do permits or want to do sequestration. So we've had a tremendous interest in Class 6 permitting. One of the things that when I first started working on this, that I was just blown away by was how many just numbers of 6 kept coming aboard with, you know, years that it took to get primacy, years that it took to get a permit. And, you know, all those things really forced us to take a hard look on what Louisiana could do and what our role would be, and really to force us to start to develop a plan for how to do that. And I think that for us, that plan, it's not necessarily something that we're going to issue from a text standpoint that everybody can read and it's a playbook, but it's initially a vision to say, how do we continue to make this a priority for the state? And I think that what the governor's done is brought all these different agencies together, and it's forced us to see what a significant role CCUS is going to play in that overall climate initiative. And then for us, our main focus right now is to make sure, as many folks have mentioned on this call, and Adam articulated very well, that having a regulatory workforce who is very well trained. And we focused on that very early on by trying to make sure that our staff is up to date with how to do CCUS permitting. Obviously, those are very complicated projects, and we want to make sure that they're ready. We have a tremendous group in the Office of Conservation who's working on primacy right now. We're hoping to be the 3rd state that's going to be issued primary enforcement for Class 6. Our collaboration with EPA has been very strong, and we see EPA as a significant partner in this, and we hope that they lean on us to get these permits reviewed, because we fully anticipate that having Class 6 permits in the state is going to be something that we're going to continue to see in the next several years. Obviously, Ben and his team have worked very hard to create a project in West Louisiana that we think is going to be very successful. And they have filed a Class 6 permit. So they were one of the first ones in Louisiana to file a permit. We think that others will follow, but there are going to be more projects that are going to be doing long-term sequestration. And one of the things that we're trying very hard to do is to bring folks to the table sooner rather than later. I think that stakeholder engagement and those opportunities for collaboration with NGOs, with environmental communities, and just with our legislator and others in the community is extremely important, because what we don't want to do is to advance projects and then have to deal with things on the back end. And I think that having folks together sooner rather than later is going to help us implement projects successfully. So I think that that's where Louisiana has been, and we will continue to be. And I think that our biggest challenge is to make sure that we're ready for the future. We had a couple questions during the previous session on offshore storage and some of the other opportunities. And those are things that even though they don't seem like they're something that we need to concentrate on now, I think that if we look at doing, which we're going to do very soon, our comprehensive energy plan and other in the climate plan, Those are the types of things that we need to flush out now, and to say that, hey, look, even though they're not necessarily a significant opportunity right at this time, they will be in the future. If you look at the opportunities for storage in Louisiana and Texas, there is a significant portion of storage potential in those two states alone. And so for us, we're trying to not only craft how we get more projects implemented in the state now, but it's continuing to make this into an opportunity that continues to bring in jobs and implementing successful projects in the future.
Thank you so much, Jason, for those thoughts. I'm really appreciated. And again, your leadership and the leadership of Secretary Harris. I'm going to move over to Ben now. So we've heard from the government perspective, the environmental NGO perspective, and excited to hear from someone who's actually doing a project, someone who's just submitted a Class 6 well permit. I mean, those are still relatively rare. How has the experience been? And maybe tell us a little bit about your project. I know Gulf Coast Sequestration made a big announcement, I think it was last month, but before that hadn't necessarily been on the radar. So there may be some of the people who are here who don't know that much about what the project is.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia, and pleasure to be with you all. Enjoyed the speakers both yesterday and today. Really our effort on behalf of Gulf Coast Sequestration has really been to try to advance the significant work that has been done academically around what available pore space there might be in this general Gulf Coast region, and actually see if we can attempt to site and build a specific project. So to take things largely from the academic universe or the theoretical universe and get down to the practical to understand what the pore space can really do. And from our perspective, based on the significant amount of work we've done over the last 2 years to better understand this region and the geology, we think that there's really 3 things that you need. And some of this has been alluded to by previous speakers, both yesterday and today. We think you obviously need control over the pore space, which we've been able to obtain. You need to be in close proximity, obviously, to CO2 producers and emission sources, which we think that our project is in close proximity. In a second, I'll come back to what that available universe of emission sources are within the area. And then the third thing, which I think candidly, we haven't spent a ton of time talking about because perhaps we have not had people that are specifically building projects, is that you have to have the right rock. And ultimately, this really does come down to the quality of the rock and one's understanding. And I think in order to get successful projects built, you need to, in these early days and in the low serial numbers of projects, you really need to have all 3 of those things. And so we're very excited that last month, after 2 years of significant technical work that was really focused on the quality of the rock, we were able to submit a Class 6 permit application to the EPA for a project that will seek to sequester 80 million tons of CO2 over 30 years, which comes to a little under 3 million tons per year, which we believe will be a sequestration hub. So obviously a lot of folks have talked about this hub and cluster model. This is a hub by definition. And we're very excited about the potential that it'll have for Louisiana, for the Gulf Coast region, and certainly for what we're attempting to do nationally.
And what do you think is the timeline for that? Have you gotten kind of any sense of how long it will take to get approval and when you could start kind of doing sequestration?
Sure. A couple thoughts on that. I mean, the first is that, the Class 6 regulations are really robust and they are well defined. I think one of the challenges is that because we have not had a lot of folks that have sought these permits, so the total number of permits that the EPA has issued to date are still below 10. So we're still in the single digits in terms of the number that have been issued nationally. So there isn't a ton of experience from either the commercial perspective or the regulatory perspective in terms of going through the process. So we wouldn't want to prejudge what we think is going to be a very robust and thoughtful analysis of our permit by the EPA. they need to take their time. And I think, as Adam noted, we really do need to get this right, both from a public policy perspective, but also from a maintaining of our environmental responsibility perspective. And so we think that that's likely to be a multi-year effort on behalf of the EPA, certainly with our permit being the first of this new wave that have been filed. So we think that that will be several years. We do think that on the back of having received that permit, we could be operational within about 12 to 18 months, depending on obviously the timeline with some of the infrastructure needs that we anticipate our customers will need to address.
Thanks. Again, I just want to remind you, if you have questions, please share them in the Q&A box. I'll be kind of moving on to those questions in a minute. Adam, I'd like to go kind of back to you and hear your kind of thoughts on whether you think currently kind of the EPA is well resourced to support this kind of development of a carbon management economy. What could be opportunities to better resource that? I mean, we will have a new administration coming in with President-elect Biden. Are you kind of hopeful that that could help kind of build out resources at EPA for this important work?
I am eternally hopeful. And so the two big appropriations projects that we're working on with respect to CCS are a substantial chunk to EPA, partially for its own operations and partially to hand out to states that have primacy and are seeking primacy in order to hire staff, because these permits take a really long time to process and you need people. And you also need people who can go out and inspect. And these people need to be trained. And so EPA has developed a Class 6 training program. Other entities are working on training programs for regulators so that they could fully understand all of the issues related in issuing a CO2, a Class 6 permit, and with all the modeling. There needs to be money to buy computers and software and data management systems. And this is a fair bit of money, and there's a fair bit of work to do here. And I'll just give a shout out to the Groundwater Protection Council's Class 6 working group on primacy, which it's housed at Groundwater Protection Council. It's chaired by Kevin Frederick, who runs the DEQ in Wyoming, and Bob Van Voorhees, who's a leading light in this space. And they are developing a document that outlines the appropriate dollar amounts for EPA and by state. So we think that's a good effort. And then the other area that we think could use more money is the DOE's Carbon Safe program, because as Benjamin mentioned, the rock really matters. And environmental integrity really starts with proper site selection. And so you really want to understand your site, because if you have a great site, you won't have a problem. If you have a bad site, you could have all sorts of problems. And this is an area where we think DOE intervention could help pick the right sites and pick them quickly and facilitate project development.
Thank you. And I'll just highlight for those of you who aren't aware, the Department of Energy's Carbon Safe program is a program that has been going on for well over a decade, that has looked to characterize underground storage in the United States. As a result, the United States is ahead of many other countries in terms of having done assessments of its storage capabilities and work on ensuring kind of the safety of geological storage. So just like with many other aspects of CCS, there's a huge kind of debt of thanks to the U.S. Department of Energy, who has done incredible work on both the technology capture side, utilization side, and storage. We are starting to get some questions in. I'll throw out one to you, Ben, and then kind of ask another question that I have. So the question that I got was the Class 6 permit for just one well or several wells? And so happy to hear that. But also, maybe start taking into, moving the conversation beyond this kind of Class 6 permitting. what else makes Louisiana attractive from a developer standpoint? Certainly, we know that one thing that has come up with developers time and again is some level of certainty, right? So knowing that there is some processes in place for enabling project development, and how has Louisiana kind of done that to make it easier for project developers to move forward?
Well, yeah, I'm happy to answer both of those. And if I don't address them specifically, I know you'll circle back to them as well, Patricia. But you know, I think the main thing that makes Louisiana attractive is that it's got a significant amount of CO2 production that needs to be abated. So obviously Lee Sockwell on the OGCI presentation noted some of the numbers: 200 million metric tons, 35 million of which are kind of pure stream. So those will be, you know, the low hanging fruit, so to speak. So that's the first thing. The second is, obviously, as Jason noted, in 2009, the state proactively passed a set of regulations around how the state was going to handle the permitting of CO2 projects within the state's borders. I think that piece of legislation gives not only project developers, but obviously capital sources a fair amount of understanding, along with obviously the insurance companies, tax equity participants as well, an understanding for how the state's going to progress and deal with issues. We think that, you know, the fact that that statute is on the books does not mean that it's written in stone. There's obviously going to be changes. We would hope from a project development standpoint, obviously, that those changes are really around, while protecting the environmental issues that Adam noted, are really around, you know, getting projects, sound projects, built and commissioned and operational. So really improving the flow of the process. Obviously, Jason and his team are doing a significant amount of work in terms of trying to receive primacy for the review of those, but that really the regulatory framework throughout the life cycle really not only does it put in place the right structure for the development, but it addresses the needs of the environmental community while also making good, sound commercial viability for those projects. In terms of our specific project and what we've submitted an application for, in our application, we're looking to site 4 wells across 2 principal project areas because we think that has the right amount of injection activity in the right location to really be absorbed within the reservoir correctly.
Great, thank you. I'll maybe jump back to Jason now. I mean, you discussed in your opening remarks, which I thought were really comprehensive, the fact that not only are you thinking about today, but tomorrow. So you kind of reflected offshore, and while, you know, it's certainly not the expectation that offshore is going to take off right away, you know, you want to be kind of ahead of those conversations. And I think, you know, it brings up this issue of there's a lot of permutations of CCS that could be happening. There's these hub and cluster models. There are more kind of direct one emitter, one storage site. You know, in terms of what's going on in Louisiana, you know, how do you prioritize, you know, how to support all these kind of numerous permutations? And,
Sure.
you know, are there other things that the state is kind of looking to do in the future to support CCS?
Absolutely, that's a great question, and one that I definitely wanted to address. So for us, Adam touched on it, and I think that again, when we started to look at the significance of trying to have a CCUS program internally and one that DNR can implement, funding is a significant concern. So that's something that not only that the states need, EPA obviously needs it. Adam mentioned the modeling software, and that's something that we stressed very early on with our federal delegation, that was going to be something that we needed to add staff. Secretary Harris discussed it yesterday in terms of adding additional folks that would be dedicated to doing this type of work, those reviews, those very intensive reviews, getting modeling software, which is very expensive. That's the other thing, is that EPA just doesn't use one suite of software to do all these well analyses. So there's a lot of upfront cost and upfront planning that has to be done to get this right. Not every state's going to have those needs, but obviously we anticipate significant needs in the UIC program for states that are implementing Class 6 primacy. The other significant thing that we are trying to do is to advance this industry and advance CCUS across all forms of manufacturing and industry in all sizes. And what I mean by that is that we want folks who are the small midstream operators, the middle guys, the large guys, everybody to have an opportunity to do CCUS projects. And one of the biggest needs that we've heard from talking to folks, and we talk to a number of people every single week who are in various stages of project development. You talk to people like Ben, who will come into a meeting and already have a project 2 weeks out from submitting a Class 6 permit. And we talk to folks that are just really starting. What is 45Q? How does this going to work? How can we become a player in this space? So the range of folks that we talk to on a weekly basis is significant. The overwhelming theme that we hear from them in terms of needs is certainty and infrastructure. And what I mean by that is, what do we do to make sure that we can continue to facilitate projects in the state? For us, we've very clearly seen that what do? Do you go out as a state that has a regulatory component? We also recognize that we couldn't go out and publish a document that basically details all the site geology to say, come put a project here, because we have to serve as regulators. We're going to lean on industry to be able to tell us where they want to make those investments. But we're trying to work with our federal partners and with DOE and others to try to create a significant, just really an emphasis on infrastructure investment to make sure that these hubs, these long-term storage potential, and these large-scale projects that we keep talking about can start to develop. And it's like you run into a conundrum of, how do you do it? Do you get a significant project and all of the other source material comes, or do you invest in infrastructure first and then other things come after? So there are a lot of things that are at play. There's a SCALE Act right now that's being floated at the federal level, which I think is specifically focused on infrastructure. And Keith mentioned a variety of other bills. And I think that those are efforts that are going to become very important, because again, for investors and for companies who are new to the space or who may have, one piece of the puzzle, they're going to look for those pipeline investments and those other pieces to be able to make all the economics make sense. And you have people with a wide range of project values that are trying to use just 45Q, and you have others that are attacking 45Q with LCFS. So we're trying to target federal programs and to try to work with them to create pathways at the federal level that can help in all forms of development. And I think that for us, it's very important to have a very strong relationship, not only with EPA, DOE, and our other federal partners, but again, continue that collaboration internally to make sure that we have a clear vision to see what's most important for projects from every walk of life in the sense of size, timing, and value. So.
Thank you so much, Jason. And we just have a couple of minutes left. So I'm going to kind of share my last couple questions so we can move quickly through them. So Ben, there have been a ton of questions on how much do you intend to charge for your services, what's your revenue model, et cetera. So I'll see what you're ready to share about that topic. And then it was directed towards Adam, but happy to hear any of your perspectives. So it was, curious about rejoining the Paris Agreement. So certainly President-elect Biden has said that will be one of his first acts. What do you think that could do for CCUS, both in terms of concrete pieces of policy that have been sitting around, I would say, and you talked more generally to kind of EPA support, et cetera. So I'll go to Ben first.
Sure. So in regards to, what the revenue model looked like, what we would charge, I would just say that, we're certainly open for business and are happy to talk to market participants about their needs to store CO2 and how we might help them in that service to get their CO2 underground and safely and securely stored. I think that, candidly, the price here largely depends on the activities that we're being asked to do, whether or not we're participating in the capture component and the transport component as well. I would point folks to the MPC study I think that study, which was obviously published in December of last year and commissioned by the Department of Energy, I think did a really good job of talking about the bucketing of cost at different levels of a CO2 price or a CO2 tax credit price. And so I think that that report gives, a pretty solid range. Obviously, as many folks have noted, we're dealing with a certain pie here on a 45Q only basis, which is $50. And so we certainly believe that the projects that are going to be successful are the ones in which all of the participants, from the landowner through to the capture co, are having a positive economic outcome.
Thanks, Ben. And Adam, you want to maybe give some last thoughts?
Sure. So, in terms of facilitating progress towards Paris and also upcoming domestic climate goals, I would point again to appropriations to EPA for pass through to states to facilitate permitting the carbon safe program. And then I would also echo Ben's recommendation to take a look at the NPC report, which has dozens of recommendations for what should be done to facilitate project development and the growth of the CCS industry in the United States.
Okay, thank you everyone for that session. It certainly was fantastic, and I thought it was kind of a great way to end these sessions with perspectives from NGOs, the government, and project developers. So what we're going to do at this point is move into our breakout sessions. And as we stated yesterday, we will have 3 breakout sessions. We're going to have a conversation with Keith Tracy on, if you had questions on 45Q that you didn't get answered, or you want to kind of directly talk about a project idea and get Keith's input, you have the opportunity to do that in breakout 1. For breakout 2, Brian Hill will talk about putting CCUS projects together, and happy to talk through specific examples you want to share. In breakout 3, Jason Langclose and friends, he'll have some other people with him from the state. We'll talk about, the Louisiana context and how they want to support you, and that's around liability, permitting, et cetera. So those are the three breakout sessions. I think that in the chat box, are we going to put the link again one more time? So there you go. So please don't click on this until the webinar has ended. They actually use the same system. And so once we end this webinar, then you can click on that. But if you want to copy and paste it into your URL so you have that, you should have also received an email from the Institute yesterday with this link. You should, again, see these options to choose your breakout session. As I explained yesterday, if you are kind of on an earlier version of Zoom, below 5.4, you may have issues seeing those breakout sessions and choosing that. You still have some time before we start in 10 minutes or so to download the next version of Zoom. But if you have any issues moving into the breakout sessions, just kind of enter the chat box in that Zoom meeting, or you'll have the ability to turn on your own video, turn on your mic, and just kind of ask the questions, and we'll move you into the appropriate breakout session. In those breakout sessions, just FYI, you do have the ability to move back and forth between the breakout sessions. We will not be recording those. So certainly hope, though, you have some interactive conversations. As I said before, this whole 2-day event has been recorded. It will be on our website, the Global CCS Institute website. It's under the tab Resources, and then under the Audiovisual Library. You can also see past events there, so we encourage you to go and look at all of that information. Wanted to again thank our partners here with the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Fossil Energy, and the U.S. Energy Association. Great partners and leaders in supporting CCS. Certainly, as I said the first day, if you want to connect more with the Institute, happy to do that. I've already had some people reach out to me on LinkedIn certainly do that. I think one of the things that certainly we've all learned in this 2-day session is that it's going to take a whole community, not only to address climate change, but build a carbon management economy. And we're happy to play our part in making connections and continuing to advocate for this important technology as we move forward. And then one more plug, the Global Status of CCS report comes out on December 1st. We will be having an exciting event that week, so be on the lookout for information there. With that, we will close this event. As I said, there will be a quick break. We'll start in just about 10 minutes, 10:45 Central. We will start. Those will be open though. We'll kind of open them immediately after this. So if you want to go and check and make sure that you can get out and get into your breakout rooms, you can do that. And then take a break. We will start the sessions at 10:45 Central. But again, thank you so much for your participation. And thank you again to all of our panelists for the great content. See you soon.